Hello and welcome to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi. Today's review, we're going to be looking at cookies. So I think the value in reviewing different companies from industry to industry is, I guess the basis is the fact that personal data exists in every single industry. I am a bit familiar with Marsh. I know that they provide some insurance products. I don't know everything about their services, but I think the value of looking at cookies is to educate businesses on the fact that these do constitute personal data, which is why there is more and more insights on websites related to an exclusive cookie notice. Now, in some places, you might see a privacy notice, and the privacy notice might discuss the fact that cookies are being collected. But more and more, particularly in 2026, and if you've watched any videos on the channel, we are seeing that businesses are creating separate web pages addressing cookies solely. Now, I think some of the influences on this are the ever-growing and evolving privacy landscape, meaning that more and more countries are either executing or enacting legislation that is specific to privacy, or they are upgrading the existing privacy legislation to cover more and more personal data identifiers. So I think that could be the influence. The other influence that I could see is that businesses are recognizing that regulators are becoming more and more strict about the enforcement actions that are levied against organizations that fail to adhere to the data protection laws. So businesses are taking it more seriously because regulators are issuing higher and higher fines. And I think one of the biggest distinctions that I can think about is the US has definitely made an immense amount of strides in terms of, one, enacting more state privacy legislation. That's something that's newer in the last 6 or 7 years. And then in addition to that, the fines are becoming larger in the United States. The fines have always been kind of large in the European Union. And I've talked about this on many reviews. Geography really matters for businesses, but the heaviness of the fines and the press that organizations are now getting when their privacy practices do not comply is becoming more and more frequent. So I think that definitely influences businesses on creating a separate cookie notice. I will also say something else about cookies specifically. Generally, you'll see in these cookie notices things like cookies and related tracking technologies. Now, this is very important because this differs from cookies. Now, let me explain a couple things. You can see here these web beacons, tracking pixels, and log files, right? Even though all of them are collectively referred to here as cookies, the importance of this is, I've talked about this in other cookie reviews, that there is a level of sophistication that businesses can collect information when we land on their websites, right? Now, I don't know that for a fact here, but I'm just giving an explanation. If I was to click on services, right, and I was to click cyber risk, there are certain tracking technologies as a result of this click that could be fed back to this organization, telling them that, one, here are the cookies related to this individual at this IP address. And then also that individual likes cyber risk, right? That information is very valuable. Imagine a site gets thousands and millions of clicks every single day. So knowing that 50%, for example, of people are clicking cyber risk is very valuable because what are they going to go and do? Obtain that data, distribute it amongst the business, and focus their efforts on cyber risk, right? So that differs a little bit from cookies because you can place that in lots of different areas, which is a bit different to cookies. So it's valuable to discuss because many more companies are utilizing this to obtain data on how us as consumers interact with their website and then other features that they have available. It could be the app, it could be, AI features, any type of feature that a business has, but they could put certain types of tracking technologies to obtain additional data outside of cookies. Now, the first thing we're going to do after that explanation is we're going to manage our cookies here. You can see here that all of these are turned on, right? Blue, blue, blue. Now, I talk a lot about geography. I know that Marsh definitely operates in the United States. I don't know the other geographies, but the US definitely. Because I am located in the United States, I presume that there is information that is fed back to this preference center, indicating that the obligation this business has to me is to give me the option to opt out, which is what I'm doing here. That's what this action is. Now you can see that this is an affirmative action, right? Because when we look at something called legal basis in the data protection world, legal basis is if you're going to process personal data, you have to rely on something called the legal basis. One of those legal bases is something called consent. Consent requires an affirmative action, right? The affirmative action I've just taken here was to turn off the advertising cookies. Now, as I landed on the site, they had already started being collected. Why? Because the geography that I'm in allows that type of processing, okay? In other geographies, that processing is not okay. And that's why different variations of a site could be presented to residents depending on what the privacy law dictates there. And this is very important. Whenever we process personal data, one, we need to rely on a legal basis. And two, having this preference center allows this organization to capture the consent or capture the action that I've just completed. So I presume, and I'm not sure, let me scroll down. I wanted to see if I could identify who the third party is that facilitates this preference center. But generally what happens with some organizations is they'll have something called a cookie consent management platform. That platform facilitates this on the site, meaning that the platform that is procured by an organization, they will help the organization manage when somebody takes an action. So how I've just clicked off of functional cookies, analytic cookies, this one was already off, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. Analytic cookies, functional cookies, and then advertising cookies. This action that I took to switch it off gets fed back to the organization so they know exactly how to configure my interaction with their site. Because now I've turned off advertising cookies, they won't be able to use these cookies to deliver advertising that's more relevant to me, right? So there's like a process flow, cookie related. Now let's talk a bit about do not sell or share my personal information. Now in the United States, again, and I would be interested to see if this feature exists for European residents, but specifically in the United States, there's legislation that requires businesses to present an option to individuals to give them the right to opt out of the sale or sharing of their personal information, right? These two words mean something very specific in that legislation, which is why it's very important for businesses to identify the geographies where they provide their products and services and identify where they process personal information. Both of those questions are very, very different. Okay, you always need to make a distinction between them because where you offer your products and service may not be the only place where you process personal data. You might have vendors and partners exclusively in China, but you're not selling in China. You're only selling in the States. But the fact that you're processing personal data in both geographies influences the type of legislation you have to adhere to. Now, that's just an example, right? So this was toggled off because I did not opt into it. And we're going to keep the same and save our options. Let's talk a bit about strictly necessary cookies. So because these allow the website to function, they are always on. You can't exercise any option or provide affirmative action here. These are always on, and you can see I've clicked it a couple times, but I cannot change it. So let's save this. I think talking about the consent management process is important because it is a feature of your notice. It's very vital not just to draft a notice. It's very important to also have that consent platform because otherwise, what other legal basis are you going to rely on with respect to cookies, right? Depends on geography. Every geography has its own respective legal basis that a business can rely on for certain activities because there's lots of different activities. Let me give you an example. One activity could be obtaining employment information from a prospect. That's a different activity to processing cookies, both of which still contain different types of personal data. So every activity has its own specific consideration. And in order for a business to be compliant with the data protection laws, they've got to look at a list of all their processing activities and identify what are the legal, one, obligations, and two, responsibilities, because I think those are different, right? These are your obligations. Provide transparency. And then what are your responsibilities? In order to be transparent, we need to present a notice. In order to be transparent, we need to have so-and-so. We need to have a consent platform, blah, blah. So there's lots of different features, mostly dependent on geography. Although we didn't get time to look at the notice, I will do that in another video. But I hope you enjoyed the review of the consent management platform process. And if you have any comments about what I've said, leave a comment below and I'll see you in another one.